Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Philip Bloom. I'm the curator of the Chinese Garden here at the Huntington. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to a conversation with Dr. Robert Newman. I'd like to express my particular thanks today to the Carol, Edward, Ariana, and Joseph Wong Trust, and to the Justin Vanya Memorial Fund for supporting our lecture series this year. Before we begin, please take note of the emergency exits marked in red, and please also set your cell phones or other noise-making devices to silent mode. I'd like to start today by providing a little bit of context for our lecture series this fall. Some of you may have heard bits of this before, but I think these contextual remarks may still be useful for audience members who are not as familiar with the Huntington. So as many of you know, last spring we opened the Caiyaopu, which is literally the plot for picking medicines. It's a small section of our Chinese garden that's dedicated to the cultivation of Chinese medicinal plants. Fundamentally, our medicinal garden is a place for considering the relationships between people and plants, and it's home to a collection of about 120 different species, each of which plays an important role in Chinese medicine, past and present. The plants have been divided into a series of beds that exemplify some of the ways that people use and think about flora. So there are 3 beds that are devoted to fundamental herbs. These are Chinese plants that have been used medicinally for at least 2,000 years, if not longer. One bed showcases imported plants, that is, herbs from India, Central Asia, and even the Americas, that became part of the Chinese pharmacopoeia through centuries of trade. Another highlights common foodstuffs that are also medicinal, so things like ginger or silk gourd or garlic chives. A third foregrounds medicinal plants that have other practical uses as dyes, as pigments, as oils, etc. The general landscaping of this section of the garden also points to the medicinal functions even of common ornamentals like chrysanthemums or peonies or flowering trees. But most importantly, a final bed gestures toward the broader philosophical framework that underlies Chinese herbal medicine. It includes plants that represent the 5 flavors, which are correlated with the 5 phases, cycles of generative and destructive energy that flow through the cosmos. Collectively, these beds tell a story about people and plants that's at once universal and specific. Humans everywhere make use of plants as medicines, as foods, as dyes, and as ornamentals, but it's really only in China, I think, that plants are part of a cosmology that really describes the relationships among all things in the world. To help elucidate some of these themes, but also more generally to celebrate the opening of the medicinal garden, we're devoting this year's Center for East Asian Gardens lecture series to Chinese medicinal plants. In the Chinese garden, we've also opened an exhibition called Growing and Knowing in the Gardens of China, which includes some historical depictions of medicinal gardens as well as guides to their cultivation. The Caiyaopu, of course, is the product of many, many, many people, but its plants really are the progeny of 2. Our speaker 2 weeks ago, Peg Schaefer, whose germplasm at the Chinese Medicinal Herb Farm in Petaluma forms the core of our collection, and then today's speaker, Dr. Robert Newman, who gathered in China the forebears of many of the plants that we're now growing. Dr. Newman is Emeritus Dean of Clinical Education at Emeritus College of Oriental Medicine in Culver City. For more than 30 years, he's practiced acupuncture, acupressure, massage, herbology, dietetics, and even shamanism. He received his Bachelor of Science in Pre-Med Biology from UC Irvine in 1989, and then went on to receive a Master's in Chinese Medicine from the American College of Traditional Chinese Medicine in 1992. Over the course of his career, he's taught holistic and Chinese medicine at a number of institutions, including San Francisco State University, the California Healing Arts College, Emperor's College, and Yosan University. But perhaps most importantly for today's conversation, he also spent about 1.5 years as a curator of the Chinese Medicinal Herb Garden at the Nanjing Institute of Botany in China. And he later founded the Chinese Medicinal Garden at American College of Traditional Chinese Medicine. Today, he's still a beloved advisor to many cultivators of Chinese herbs throughout the US. So for the next probably half an hour to 45 minutes, Dr. Newman and I will have a conversation, and then we'll begin with some questions about his background and his career, and then we'll move more specifically into questions about medicinal plants. At the end of the conversation, we'll open to questions from you all in the audience. And if you're watching online, please feel free to post questions into the chat box, and I'll try to pose them to Dr. Newman myself later on. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Newman, and we'll get things started. First, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to spend the day with you and to get to learn about our medicinal plants from you. So can you just begin by telling us about your background? How did you get into Chinese medicine and into medicinal plants more specifically?
How much time do you have? Well, okay, so the plant interest started when I was a very young kid. I was about 2 years old, and I started growing vegetables, and I would love nature. I was fascinated with all sorts of things out of nature. And later on, I grew ornamental plants, and I got into orchids, and then succulents when I was older. And I started getting into holistic medicine as sort of my path into medicinal plants. I was a musician as a teenager and a little later than that. And so a friend of mine, his brother, was into holistic medicine, and I started talking to him, and he got me interested in holistic approaches, and so I started reading, and I tend to go to extremes, so I got obsessed with it and got more and more interested. And I first probably got interested in the medicinal plants of Southern California, around the area where I lived, in the Santa Monica Mountains in that region. And I would go out occasionally on walks and learn to identify what those plants were and try to learn about how they were used for medicine. And so that was my first introduction. Part of my process when I was getting interested in holistic medicine was to try different approaches, get treatments from different practitioners. So I got treated by acupressurists, acupuncturists, homeopaths, all sorts of different practitioners. And the acupuncture interested me because particularly the herbal part of the medicine, it was a very big part of the tradition. And at the time, though, I really actually wanted to be a homeopath. But in California, there was no license for it at that time. But I learned that licensed acupuncturists were allowed to use non-drug substances as part of their practice. And at that time, the definition was very vague and general, so I thought, that might include homeopathy. So if I get my license as an acupuncturist, then I can also practice homeopathic medicine. And so I went to school first to get my pre-med degree, and then ended up going to American College and getting my degree over there. And when I first got there, I looked around at the land and noticed that there was quite a bit of space to be able to grow plants. And already having, as I said, an interest in both plants and medicinal plants, I thought, okay, well, maybe I could do something here. I spoke to the president of the college, and he said, well, actually, we had a medicinal garden there before, and I did see a couple of drought-tolerant plants that still were there, but they only survived without care because they were low-water plants. He said nobody took care of the garden previously, and so he didn't really want to support what I was going to do. He gave me a pat on the back and he said, I'll support you emotionally, but that's about it. We're not putting any more money out. They even had a peony they brought over from China to great expense, and that died. So I waited about a year until I felt like I was a little more, a little bit of a bigger fish in that pond. And then I started trying to find sources for medicinal plants, Chinese medicinal plants, and learn which ones were used as primary remedies. And then I would, plant them in pots and transfer them into the garden.
Great, thank you. Was there anything, did you find Chinese medicine to be particularly efficacious? Or was there anything in particular about the kind of philosophical structure underpinning Chinese medicine that you found attractive? Or was it truly happening to be the circumstances of homeopathy not being licensable that
well, like I said, I did love the
path?
idea of the herbal medicine being a big part of the practice. Also, I don't know why, but it's really interesting. I've had this sort of feeling of a connection to the Chinese philosophy. And when I ended up, as you mentioned earlier, I was there for 1.5 years, and I felt like it was a second home to me. Somehow there's something in me that is very, connected to that culture and everything. And I found it is interesting, for a lot of people with the Western thinking, the philosophy and the concepts in Chinese medicine and East Asian medicine are so foreign that it takes a while for people to really get comfortable with them. For me, it was very quick and easy. I think, again, I would say that I could attribute it to that feeling I had of connection to the culture and everything. I think that's also probably why I was drawn to it.
So speaking of these ideas, since you have taught Chinese medicine, what are the kinds of basic principles of Chinese medicine that you think we all should know about, and maybe people like me who are have not really become very familiar with the tradition might not know?
Well, okay, again, how much time do you have?
I know, it's a huge question, but if you had to say, these are the 3 or 5 things that you really need to know about Chinese medicine.
Yin and yang, of course. Everybody,
Okay.
Well, not about everybody, but a lot of people have heard of those terms. And they're such important concepts because they're overriding principles that describe not only Chinese herbs and medicinal plants and whatever. It describes everything in the universe. I mean, if you understand yin and yang, you can understand all sorts of things about the processes of our world and as I said, the universe itself. Yin is considered to be associated with substance, with fluids. It's cooling as opposed to warming. It's more grounding. It's associated with the earth, with nighttime. Internal as opposed to external. The earth as opposed to heaven, or below as opposed to being above. That's sort of the basic ideas of it. Yin is much more grounding, and it's reflective, contemplative. Yang is exactly the opposite. So it's more about heating and energy and activity. As I said, it has to do with the outside. It has to do with the above as opposed to below. What else? It's not substance, it's really more just energetic. And if you understand those principles, that's sort of a good basic thing. There's concepts like qi that some people have heard of. That's a good one to kind of have an understanding about. Qi is more than just energy. A lot of times people only associate it with energy, but it's about all processes. Qi has to do with, it's an aspect of yang, and it has to do with all functions and activity and processes. It's said to be energy at the verge of changing into matter, and matter at the verge of changing into energy. But it also sort of guides and directs and makes everything happen. It's in our bodies, it has to do with warming, and it has to do with protection, and it has to do with digestion and metabolism, and making blood flow, and all sorts of activities. Any functions you can think of, qi is behind it all. So that's an important concept too. And these things are also, of course, part of the philosophy of the approach to understanding the properties and the nature of herbs as well. Different herbs, act on qi, or act on yang, or act on yin, and act on other things. There's considered 5 fundamental substances. There's 8 principles, which includes yin and yang, hot and cold, and so on. So the herbs are connected, or understanding of the herbs is connected to these principles and these ideas.
Great, thank you. Well, can we talk more specifically about how, can you give us some examples of, an herb acting on yang or an herb acting on yin, and perhaps how you actually feel that in your own body?
Say that again?
So could you give us some examples of, an herb that acts on yang or an herb that acts on yin, and more specifically, how you might actually sense that in your own body?
Okay. So we were talking actually earlier about ginseng, and probably even here in the West, most people know about ginseng. They've heard about it. Some of you may have used it, of course. So typically ginseng, the ones that you'll find in most sources here in the U.S., a lot of it is either Korean ginseng or maybe Chinese ginseng that's been processed. And ginseng that's been processed or steamed tends to be more heating. Especially the Korean ginseng, that's the hottest. It's been processed or steamed more, so it adds more heat to it. And so it's a better yang tonifier, yang strengthener. It's not very good for helping with the yin aspect of the system, but it's very good for helping the yang. So what does that mean? It means you start taking it and you may feel a lot more energy. You may feel kind of stronger. You may feel like you have more stamina. It's an adaptogenic. But it can also make you feel hot. It can also end up causing night sweats in some people. It can also cause anxiety or jitteriness, because that over energy that it kind of, that very strong energy that it can provide you can be excessive for some people who are already kind of, hyperactive or wound up. So there's a lot of people in our culture who have that kind of nervous system issue, and you have to be careful with it. But it can really give you some, strong energy and warm you. It's great, if you're out in, Minnesota in the wintertime, it could be something that might be very useful. But even then, if you have a tendency for, like I say, being kind of wound up or having too much heat in your system, you've got to be careful. Now, interestingly, on the other side of that is American ginseng. Again, a lot of people might think that ginseng is ginseng. It's called ginseng. It's all the same. But American ginseng is kind of the opposite to that. It's more for tonifying or strengthening the yin, and it's grounding. It helps build fluids, which again is a yin aspect. And mildly will strengthen the qi. So it might give you a little bit of energy, but not so much. What it's going to do is calm you down more. It will cool you down if you have too much heat in your system, if you feel too hot. For example, somebody who's got, a woman who's got hot flashes and night sweats from, perimenopausal symptoms, then, that could be a possible, herb that could help. It will also help you sleep a little bit because it's calming you and anchoring you. May make you less, help you if you're thirsty and you tend to feel dried out, it'll help you reduce that. So that's sort of, kind of the basic idea.
Great, thank you. And in a similar vein, we've mentioned 5 phases or 5 forces of the cosmos, which in plants are correlated to 5 flavors or to organ systems, that sort of thing. Could you just talk a little bit about how the flavors of herbs work, and how they're meant to interact with each other in the context of a prescription or things like that?
So the tastes or flavors of the herbs, there's bitter, there's sweet, there's salty, there's sour, there's bland, and the flavors are really connected with certain functions. There's also acrid, I did mention that one. They're associated with certain activities or functions. So, for example, a bitter herb is said to be drying, and it can clear heat out. Typically, a lot of the herbs that clear heat out or excessive heat in the system are bitter a lot of times, bitter and cold. So, these flavors, they may be what the herb actually tastes like, or they may not be. They may just be, again, something that is used to identify or connect with what the herb's property is, what it can do. And let's see, for like example, I was mentioning bitter cold herbs. So a lot of those herbs are used for infections. Because infections often have signs of heat. You'll see redness and swelling that has inflammation and redness around it. You may have yellow mucus, yellow phlegm. There may be a fever or something of that nature with it. A person may get dried out and have signs of that from too much heat. So bitter cold herbs will often be used for treating these infections. Does that answer your question? Or?
That does, yeah. So basically, if you're fighting the heat of the infection with the coldness of the herb, and because bitterness is associated with kind of ridding the body of certain substances, is that the idea?
Yeah, well, the bitter herbs too. They are useful, like I said, for clearing out the heat. Yeah. And they'll dry the dampness if there's dampness that's present there. But that tends to be a connected sort of function or property with the herbs that do that.
That brings up another related question too. What's the relation? In our garden, we have a bed that's devoted to the 5 flavors, which is part of the reason I just asked about that. In our garden too, every plant is identified with a label giving its name in English, Chinese, and its Latin scientific name, but we also do indicate the temperature and flavor or taste of the plant. So what is the temperature of a plant? What does that actually mean, either in conceptual or physiological terms?
So I could give you some examples too that everybody can identify with.
That's great.
I talk to students about this when they're new students.
Yep.
And learning about herbs, and I say, you may not realize it, but you already know something about cinnamon.
Right.
Cinnamon is used in East Asian medicine. It's a commonly used herb. Ginger is commonly used in East Asian medicine. Everybody here knows that those substances are warming. You take some ginger tea or put some cinnamon in something that you want to drink during the winter time that you want to feel warmer when it's cold. So those things are warming. If you taste cinnamon, it's kind of sweet. It's got a little sweetness to it when you let it sit in your mouth. And it's got a little acidness, a little spicy quality. Ginger too, it's not only warming, but it also is acrid. On the other hand, something like mint, you see mint in ice cream, mint in, drinks, mint juleps and things like that. Mint's associated with, cooling you off in the summertime. And it is cool, it's also acrid. So those flavors, those temperatures, have to do with what the herb will actually do. It'll make you feel. If you take an herb that's very warming, I'll go back again to the ginseng, that's the Korean ginseng especially, and you take that when you have an infection and you've got fever, you could actually make somebody a lot worse. Again, going back to the example with a woman who's perimenopausal, you give her some ginseng and it's going to heat her up. It's like adding gasoline to a fire. So you have to be cautious about this. You have to be careful because this goes into something that I always talk about when I talk about herbs to the general public. Things from nature are not necessarily harmless or safe. People think because it's from nature, it's much less strong than a Western medication, so it's safe. And although there's truth to that, you can cause yourself some harm if you don't know what you're doing with herbs. And not only that, there are herbs that are toxic. And there are a lot of toxic things in nature, and there's a lot of toxic things in the East Asian pharmacopoeia. So it's not necessarily safe because it's from nature. And as I mentioned earlier about using ginseng when somebody's got too much heat, you don't want to do that. You can make somebody much worse with their condition. Depending on how much you give them, it could really be harmful. at the least, you could make them, very uncomfortable. So you have to be smart about what you are doing. And as a layperson, it's better if you leave that into the hands of somebody who's been trained. Because as I say, a lot of these substances are not, harmless. They're not innocuous. They have potent effects, and you need to be careful about that, The one thing I'll say, you're bringing up the tastes and the temperature of these herbs, and there's, an elaborate understanding about the functions of many herbs. They may have several different functions, what organs they act on, what tissues they act on, what they do, what they treat, what symptoms they treat, and what the dosage is, and what the contraindications are, and what herbs they shouldn't be given with, and what herbs work better with them. And this is an aspect of holistic medicine too. Another thing I like to let people know about when I talk about this medicine and general medicine, holistic medicine, holistic medicine is an approach to how you understand the patient and the treatments that you have that are correlated with that understanding. So typically in holistic medicine, it's not just that you're using something from nature. That's not necessarily holistic, because you can treat one symptom with something from nature, and to me that's very non-holistic. It's very allopathic. But what you want to do is you want to look at the person. First of all, one concept I think that's really critical with holistic medicine is that you're treating the whole person. So that you look at the body and you see that the mind, body, and even spirit, if you will, are all interacting and connected, and you can't just treat one part of that and not have an effect on the other part of it, and you can't neglect treating the rest of it when you treat one part because of that connection. Another aspect that's really important of holistic medicine is that you're treating people as individuals, not generalizing. Western medicine tends to generalize as much as possible, but in this medicine, we want to treat the people as individuals. Not only that you are different from anyone else, but also that you are different from how you were 6 months ago and different from how you'll be 6 months from now. So we're trying to look at you specifically as what is going on with your system and at this point in time, and not going to treat you, everybody who has a headache, it's not always from the same cause. There are multiple, in our medicine, there are multiple reasons for why you might have a headache. And we try to understand what the cause is and then address it appropriately, specifically, rather than just giving a general remedy for pain or something like that.
Great. That brings up lots and lots of questions. But the first I want to ask is about how you go about approaching a prescription. I think it's relatively uncommon that in Chinese medicine, that you would just prescribe a singular substance that is not being compounded with other substances. So how do you go about thinking about how different herbs will interact in order to have the desired effect on a patient?
So for one thing, there is a history of formulas, that goes back hundreds of years, maybe even more than that, millennia possibly. And there have been combinations of certain herbs being used together in these formulas that are well known to be more effective. So, and there's a whole understanding called Dui Yao, which is using two herbs, like pairs of herbs, that are known to be better when they're used together than as opposed to their effects separately from each other. So you learn that. That's part of what you learn. When you learn the formulas, you learn some of that information. And you look at the chief complaint of the patient. You look at what's underlying and what's going on. You think about what possible contraindications might exist. Somebody has high blood pressure, and you don't want to give ginseng, or you want to be very careful. Or licorice. Licorice can, worsen high blood pressure, so maybe you don't give that. Or somebody has too much heat, as I said, so you've got to be careful not to put too many heating herbs in the formula. And you should have that in the back of your mind when you're constructing the formula. You keep these ideas, present. And so you're going to look at the chief complaint, and you're going to say, oh, well, let's say somebody has fatigue, but maybe they've also got some problem with their knee, and there's swelling there, and it's cold, and maybe they've got insomnia. And so you're looking at first treating the fatigue, and you might use a number of herbs to treat that, tonify the qi. But you might also use some other herbs to help address that, maybe by using it for helping strengthen the kidneys too, because the kidneys are your core, so maybe you're approaching that also with using 1 or 2 herbs for that. And then you're thinking, okay, well, maybe I can do something to help the knee, but that's a more minor problem. Their chief complaint is the fatigue. So I'm just going to put in 1 or 2 herbs that might help with some of the damp and the swelling. And you're also realizing, well, the swelling and water metabolism is actually controlled by qi. And your spleen, a certain organ that is described in this medicine. So by strengthening the qi and by strengthening the spleen and helping the fatigue, you're also helping the water balance and helping maybe reduce the swelling. But you can use something that will maybe help address this area more locally. There are herbs that actually go to the lower part of the body. You can put that in. You may also, use something for the insomnia to help calm the person. I want to use herbs that are too sticky or difficult to digest, because if they have fatigue, it means maybe that their organ of digestion, which is responsible for helping produce energy, may also be weak. So you don't want herbs that are going to, make the digestive system have more strain. So you pick certain herbs that are helping the insomnia, but you don't want to use, something that's too heavy. And then you may put in something that's going to help harmonize. There are certain herbs like licorice and like the dates, the Chinese dates, that are used for harmonizing if you cook them together with the other herbs. So you may put in, a couple of those herbs. And, you do something like that where you're looking to maybe address several things, and you're trying to make sure that when you do this, you don't create an imbalance somewhere else or create a worsening of some other problem that the patient has. And you're trying to help put their system into, like I said, a more balanced state, and doing it, while looking at their whole body.
Wonderful, thank you. That's very helpful for me, at least. This is a very similar question. I hope you'll indulge it. But one question that our docents are asked frequently when they're working in the medicinal garden is, what herb should I take for this particular condition? And usually it's asked in the form of, what herb should I take when I have a cold? How should one respond to that question when working in a Chinese medicinal herb garden?
So, that goes back to what I was saying a little bit earlier. Not everybody has the same symptoms when they have a cold, right? Not everybody has the same symptoms, as I said, when they have a headache, or not everybody's going to have the same symptom when they have, knee pain or low back pain. So you can tell somebody your particular needs have to be addressed specifically. I can't generalize and say that this substance or this herb is going to always be good for everyone who has a cold, because that's not the case. And some herbs, as I said, are cooling and warming, so you can say, some herbs have a cooling nature and some have a warming nature. Your particular condition, may be more where you have cold or more where you have heat. You have to address that appropriately. And it's not always just that simple too, because there's people get wind heat. Okay, wind heat in East Asian medicine, typical symptoms, you may have a low fever, you get a sore throat. It starts out like usually a sore throat. You may get some little bit of sweats. You're thirsty. Your pulse gets more rapid. And so classic formula, if your throat starts getting worse, is yin shao san. Some of you may have heard of that formula. You can get it in, the Chinatown pharmacies. I almost never prescribe that formula by itself. Either I'll write a formula from scratch and use some of the components of it, or I will give it with some other formula at a lower dose because of this reason. The herbs, I mentioned before about bitter cold herbs being used to treat infections and things like that. So this is a bitter cold formula. It's very bitter, very cold. And what happens is it weakens the digestive system if you take it too much. And if you already have a weak digestive system, then it's going to possibly worsen that. You know how antibiotics tend to make people have digestive problems and diarrhea? Well, one of the reasons we say in this medicine is because it is a bitter cold substance. So I don't give it to the majority of people. I see too many people running around who have weak digestive systems. We say weak spleen qi. And if you give cold things to people like that, bitter cold substances, you'll make them worse. Plus, in Yin Shaosan, there's nothing to strengthen the immune system, nothing to tonify the qi. Your qi, as I mentioned earlier, is supposed to help protect you and ward off, pathogens. It also helps to expel the pathogens from your system. So it has nothing in it really to tonify the immune system. So I will typically put in a couple of herbs to do that, and that's why I like writing my own formula. These herbs also help protect the digestive system so that the bitter cold herbs don't end up weakening the digestive system and making somebody have diarrhea, and possibly weakening them to the point where they may not be able to get rid of the cold very quickly. They get rid of a lot of the symptoms, but the actual infection, the organism, stays there for a long period of time, and in my experience, sometimes can even stay there chronically for years. And it can lead to things like autoimmune conditions. So, I think it's important, to tell somebody, you can't treat yourself with this stuff. I can't, give you some instant answer to, how to treat your cold, because it's not that simple. And you don't want it to be that simple if you want the results to be effective and you want it to not cause other problems for you.
Fantastic, thank you. I want to move away a little bit from medicine and go back sort of to your personal story and also to plants. I mentioned in the introduction to you that you did work as the curator of a medicinal garden in China. And I'm wondering, A, how you ended up there, and B, what sorts of work you were actually doing in China.
So B, what was B?
What sorts of work you were actually doing as the curator of that medicinal garden.
So...
And then we'll get into how it affected your career in the US too.
My wife says it didn't really do anything for my career, so but I met her through that, so that was good. So the way I got to that was that I had developed the herb garden, as you'd mentioned in my intro. I developed the herb garden at American College of Traditional Chinese Medicine. You did mention that there, right? Yeah.
You mentioned it.
Oh, okay. There we go. So I knew somebody said that. So I developed that herb garden there for 5 years, and during that time, part of what I did to try and find sources for medicinal plants and seeds was to contact botanic gardens in China and Japan and other parts of Asia. And I made contact with a couple of gardens really solidly. One was in Beijing, it wasn't the Beijing Botanic Garden, it was the Institute of Medicinal Plant Development in Beijing. And the other one was in Nanjing. That was the Nanjing Institute of Botany. And the director of that Nanjing Institute of Botany sort of fancied himself as an international figure. He was like vice president of, I think, of something of the international, something of botanic gardens. So I became like more friendly with the head of the Chinese medicinal herb department they had there. They did research too. And so I got to know him as Professor Chen Chongming. And I was contacting him too after I got to know him a little, because I noticed some of the herbs in the pharmacopoeia were not the primary species that were supposed to be used for certain medicines. There were some that were like substitutes or secondary ones or adulterants. And I had learned to recognize this through growing the plants in the garden in San Francisco at that college. So I sent him samples, and I asked him if he could confirm what I thought the identity of these particular herbs were. And so he and I got to know each other better, and eventually he came to the US and visited me and stayed with me for a week or two. And I decided in 1996 that I was going to go to China. I wanted to visit there in the fall. And so I planned out my trip, and one of the things I was going to do was going to go to Nanjing and go to that Institute of Botany and meet the professor there and meet the director who I hadn't met before of the whole garden. So I go on the trip, and the director has his entourage. He's got all these people around him, and we go out to dinner one night. And I had looked at the herb garden, and there's a funny thing that goes on there in some of these institutes and these gardens. There's different departments, and the department who has more funding or more money that they bring in has more control over more of the land in the botanic garden. So at that time, the landscape department, which knew nothing about Chinese medicinal plants, was in charge of the Chinese medicinal herb garden. And I looked at the garden, earlier that day before we went out to dinner, and it was in quite a bit of disrepair. It needed a lot of work, and there was a lot of ornamentals that had been planted in the beds by the landscape department instead of medicinal plants. So we're at dinner, and the director says to me, so Robert, what do you think of the herb garden? And I didn't want to insult him. I definitely didn't want to do that. So I said, oh, it looks pretty good, but I think you need somebody like me to come here and fix it up a little bit. And I was joking, everybody laughed. Thought that was the end of it, right? So a couple days later, his secretary takes me on a trip to Suzhou. And we're in the car, and she says to me, she turns to me and she says, so, do you like China? I said, yeah, it's great, I love being here. And she said, are you interested in the job? I said, the job? What are you talking about? And she said, oh, they didn't tell you. No. And so she said, well, actually they're interested in having you possibly be the curator, they called it manager, of the herb garden there. Wow, okay, well, I started to find out more about that and eventually decided I wanted to do that. It was crazy enough, and I thought, wow, when am I going to get a chance to do this again? So that's how I got the job. So my work there was basically trying to fix the garden up. What I did, I would try to find plants. Some I even brought over from here that we were growing, stuff that I had grown at the herb garden, and then I had a network of people that I, like Peg and some other people throughout the US that I had sent material to, plants and seeds. And so some of them had some stuff that I wanted that were from another part of China than Nanjing, and I couldn't get, so I had them send me some stuff. Or I went back one time and I did bring back some things too. But I would collect a lot of stuff. We'd go out on collecting trips. And I'd I'd clean up the beds, get the weeds out, get some of the, beds fixed up, make sure they were watered properly. We put up signs. What else did we do? I was big on cleaning up the trash there. That was a big problem. I was regularly asking people not to throw their trash on the ground or poop on the ground. I'd say, look, this is your country. You want your children to, feel good about that when, they are older. You want to protect it, you want to protect the environment. And this is, a good place to learn to do that. It wasn't a thing that I was greatly appreciated for by the administration there, but I felt obligated to do it. I just couldn't stand seeing the trash, there. Sometimes we'd be digging in a bed and I'd find somebody, like some construction workers had dumped a bunch of trash there just, because it was easier. And so I was kind of railing against the forces that were in place, but I felt like I had to do it. But anyways, the goal was to basically make the garden look better and to add, new plants to it and fix up the ones that were there and make the whole place, look better for a medicinal garden. And as I said, the signs so that people could go there and look. I had one woman. This was just like a few weeks after I got there. I was with my supervisor. He spoke English fairly well, Mr. Liu, and one time this woman came by, this elderly woman, and she's in tears, and she's talking to him, And he tells her that I'm the new manager of the herb garden. And she's telling him that she's so sad that the herb garden had gone downhill so badly. And she was really hoping that, it could look better and be, a better place for people to learn about the medicine. And, I told him to say, that's my goal. That's what I want to do. This is very important to me.
So, were you also collecting plants in the wild?
Yes. We'd go out on collecting trips.
All over the country, or?
Not that far. I did go down up to Beijing, and we did go also sometimes on day trips, like maybe 5 or 6 hours away east east of where we were. West of where we were. Right. We'd go to different areas, but we didn't go too far usually. And I'd get stuff too from other botanic gardens. Like when I went up to Beijing, I went to that Institute of Medicinal Plant Development and got a bunch of stuff. I brought stuff to them. We did exchanges like that. I remember one trip we went on, I stopped the driver and we got out of the car. It was this area that I could see looked kind of interesting. And we went down this hillside and it opened up into this meadow. And there was all this self-heal, xiakucao, that was blooming. And it was like, the sunlight coming in, and it was magical. It really felt amazing, We had some really, really fun trips.
So you stayed there for 1.5 years or 2 years, something like that?
There was what?
How long did you stay at the Nanjing Institute of Botany?
How long was I there?
Yeah.
1.5 years.
And then came back to the U.S.?
Yes.
Did you bring plant material with you to enlarge your collection here?
I did. So I brought material back on that trip back home. I also went on subsequently in other years, I led some, partly I went to go see my then girlfriend, now wife, but I also led a couple of tours, 2 or 3 tours, first for nurses one time, and then for, maybe it was twice, and then for students another time. And I would collect plants on these travels around, excuse me. And what I would do, I would carry with me a duffel bag, and I'd have hundreds of plastic bags of different sizes and coin envelopes to collect seeds. And I'd have shovels and a foldable shovel and little garden trowels. And I don't know what other tools. I had all kinds of tools. And so what I would do, I would collect the plants or the seeds, and the seeds would go in the coin envelopes, but if I collected plants, I'd put them in plastic bags, and I'd have the roots sitting with a little bit of water in the bottom, and I'd basically take some water, and I'd kind of, like that, kind of spit it, sort of spray it so that the plant got, wet, and then the roots got a little water on it too, without it getting too wet. And I'd have them lined up in a hotel room all along the edges of the room. And every day I'd, open some up that were getting a little dry, and I'd, spit the water into them. And then eventually I brought them back with me. And there's a kind of a cute story. One time on one of these trips, I went to the West China University of Medical Sciences in Chengdu. And I was staying in like the kind of students, it's like a visitor student sort of little hostel kind of a thing. And so I visited an herb garden there was another medicinal garden that was nearby in the city. And I go there, and the manager comes out, and I had forgotten I had actually sent him seeds of American herbs a few years back. And so I start to try and talk to him. I'm using my poor Chinese that I had learned. And it turns out he reminds me, somehow he recognized who I was, because I started asking him about herbs and things like this. And he goes, "You're the one who sent me these, herb seeds." And I said, "Oh my God, yes." And then he had this one plant that was growing that I really wanted to get, and he had runners coming out from the ground. It was Gotong Uncaria, and it's not a plant you can find in any part of the West. And so I asked him if I could have some, these plants with the roots on it. And he said, sure. So they dig up some of it. I take out one of my plastic bags, and I put them in there, and I take out my water bottle, and I spit water into there, and then he and a couple of the workers that were with him started to laugh. And I thought, well, why are they laughing at me? I guess maybe because it's spitting or something, I don't know. And I said, Weishiman Nishawa, why are you laughing at me? And he said, he managed to communicate to me that they do this very same thing when they go out and collect plants in the wild. They also take bags with them, and they also take their water and go like that. So there was some kind of fun little universal understanding or process that we had developed on our own, separate from each other. That was the same, when we did this, thing. So it was kind of fun.
So a lot of the plants that you had been growing at American College of Traditional Chinese Medicine, and then plants that you brought back from your time in China, have, I think, ended up becoming, the forebears to Peg's Chinese Medicinal Herb Farm and to some farms in the in the South and in the Northeast too.
Yeah, so there was a grower in Asheville, North Carolina, Joe Hollis. He's passed away now, but he was a good friend, and we had collaborated. My first collaboration was with a woman named Vinnie McKinney in the Ozarks, in Missouri. She had a company called, what was it? Oh my goodness. I can't remember the name of her company. Anyways, she sent catalogs to the college, American College, and I started collaborating with her. She had some Chinese medicinal plants that she had gotten from some botanic garden or something, and she was linked with Stephen Foster, who's a good friend of hers, who's a very well-known Western herbal writer and study researcher or whatever, studier. And so I first collaborated with her. There was a woman, Jean Giblette, back in New York. She's got an organization called High Falls Gardens. She still runs it, along with Peg, trying to educate practitioners about growing medicinals and buying medicinals from growers here in the U.S. Who else was there? Cindy Rivieri in Ohio, planted herbs. So yeah, I had people I disseminated material with, because I knew it would be a stupid idea for me to be the only person who held on to material. If I lost something, that would be it. So I wanted to have, replication of this so that it, hopefully if I lost it, somebody else would have it.
So does that mean that there's a relatively narrow genetic pool for the Chinese medicinal herbs that are currently being grown in the U.S.?
Say that again?
Does that mean that there's a very shallow or narrow genetic pool for the Chinese medicinal herbs being grown in the U.S.?
Yes.
Do you have thoughts about the implications of the narrowness of that gene pool for the health or efficacy of the plants here?
Well, it's obviously not ideal. I think, I'll say a couple things about this. First of all, there are some places that are known for being the location in this part of China that produces the best Congju, or the best weights, or the best whatever, the best of this herb, the best of that herb. So, if you can get a hold of that genetic material, that's of course ideal. I do think, though, that there is some variability. I think, what I've seen is that plants turn on and off genes, and this is not, my amazing discovery. This is, but botanists and scientists who know this kind of thing goes on all the time. And you can see this with common plants like dandelions or plantain. If you see them growing in some area where they're not getting foot traffic, they'll grow much taller. But if you see them growing in a place where there's a lot of people walking on them, then they'll grow very low so that they don't get damaged when people step on them. So I think, there may be the conditions, may bring out certain compounds and chemicals that, maybe okay, let's say in this part of China, this herb isn't the best quality supposedly, but maybe here in some part of the United States, some material I collected has the genetics to be able to be better because genes are turned on by the environmental conditions that the plant is under. Maybe it's going to be worse because there aren't certain conditions that are necessary for that plant's chemical constituents to be, ideal. Maybe some other chemicals will show up that weren't typically understood to be, part of the function. So this herb is supposed to do this and this and this traditionally, and the books say that, but maybe something else arises because the plant's in a different environment. This is something that needs to be studied. And to use the plants from here, it's definitely a work in progress, and a lot of research needs to be done on that, because definitely environmental conditions change the chemical nature and the energetics of the plant. So, how it does that, has to be understood.
That more or less leads to my final question, which is just about really your hopes for the future of Chinese medicinal plants in the U.S. What kind of work do you think should be done? How do you hope the field will develop? And also, more specifically, what do you hope gardens like a botanical garden like the Huntington can do in those future efforts? So,
it's women, like I said, Jean Giblet, along with Peggy, they're trying to get growers to grow. That's one thing that needs to continue to happen. The more that we get people growing these plants in different areas, the more chance we're going to have of being able to see whose material maybe possibly is closer or right on with, what the understanding of that herb traditionally does. And then, of course, supporting that process, that's also what Jean is trying to do, is get, people to understand that these herbs are grown organically, they're identified correctly, so there aren't adulterants that are being sold or substitutes. Hopefully, practitioners are buying these plants more, or these herbs more, and using these herbs. That is the goal. It's kind of a difficult goal, though, I will say, because obviously, like I said, it needs research, and that kind of research takes a long time. The other part of this, growing things in China is a lot cheaper. So, you sell material from China, especially some of the weedier plants, it's not really economically good, useful or feasible to grow some of these things here. Dandelion, as an example, or who's going to go out and collect, pounds and pounds of dandelion? Who's going to, want to, Eclipta, another weed, or Leonurus, these things grow wild, all over the place. Who's going to want to, grow these things when they don't get much money for them? Because you're competing with the prices of the herbs that come from China, and, you can't do it with the labor, the costs that would be, involved here. So there's a feasibility that's really, in some cases, it's not realistic. If you grow herbs that are maybe bigger money makers, the ones that are more expensive, you have a better chance, maybe. And certainly ones that are often adulterated, like a good example is Siberian ginseng, which they don't call that anymore. They call it Eleuthero. But that one's often adulterated. It's either a wrong part of the plant that they use in a lot of products, or they use a different species of that family. So grow some Siberian ginseng if you can. Maybe you grow it in the northeastern part of the U.S. where it's cold and, kind of replicates the conditions where the plant normally grows in Asia. But it's a hard thing to be able to, compete with the Chinese prices. And even now in China too, they're realizing, for a number of years, some farms have been growing stuff organically because they've made individual contracts with herb distributors here in the U.S. and in the West. So I don't know if the long-term feasibility of that is really very realistic, but it has some possibilities. For botanic gardens, I think the best thing botanic gardens can do are what you're doing here. Have the plants, have signs, have talks like this and discussions and information out there. Educate the public about this. Like COVID. I know there'll be people who won't believe this, but there are hospitals and practitioners in China and in Hong Kong and Taiwan. They were having great results with both preventing people from getting sick and treating people so that they didn't, this is before the vaccine. And, okay, now COVID, we have the vaccine, but what's next? I mean, there's going to be other things. And people need to know what's available, what's possible. A lot of people out in our culture don't have any understanding of the alternatives that are available besides Western medicine. And I'm not saying Western medicine shouldn't be used, far from it. But I think the combination of the two is far, far superior. There was a practitioner I knew years ago, and he did this thing called kinesiology muscle testing, and it's pretty sketchy for a lot of people to believe in, but he was actually unbelievably good with it. And he had this patient come in, and she had a bladder infection. And she had been taking antibiotics for a couple weeks, followed the doctor's orders, and the infection almost cleared. It got much better, and then it came back. And so he did his little muscle testing process on her, and he came up with a homeopathic remedy for her. So she went back home, took the remedy. She came back in a couple weeks, and she said the same thing happened with the homeopathic remedy. She got much better, but it didn't quite clear, and then it came back. So then he gave her another homeopathic remedy, tested her, and did this muscle testing process, gave her another homeopathic remedy. She went back, took it for 2 weeks, came back, same thing. So then he told her to bring the antibiotics that she still had left, some of the ones in the bottle. She came back with the antibiotics in the bottle. He then tested her for a new homeopathic remedy. Also, and then he would check the bladder meridian, according to Chinese medicine, the bladder channel, and tested every point on the bladder meridian for the homeopathic remedy that he came up with. Only half of the points became stronger in comparison without the remedy. Then he put the antibiotic, had her hold the antibiotic and the homeopathic, and he tested all the acupuncture points on the bladder meridian again, and they were all strong. So he had her take both of them together, actually the antibiotics at a little lower dose because he felt like she was getting too much of it, and she got better and it cleared it completely up. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not against Western medicine, but the two of those things, I think, together really work better or have better potential. I would love to see them used in hospitals, to prevent all of the secondary infections that people die from. Over 100,000 a year, I think. And I think a lot of that could be prevented with using homeopathics and herbal medicines and things like that.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and passion with us. I think we should open to questions from the audience, and I'll see if I can figure out how to take questions online too. We'll circulate a microphone too. Michelle is circulating it.
You touched a little bit on how the future could possibly change as far as bringing more genetics from China to the US. One thing that I've kind of just thought about is to just find more parallels between the two types. One, I guess, kind of more simple example would be mugwort for moxa. So Artemisia chinensis to like Artemisia glauciana. And wondering if you've ever tested like the parallels and find any similarities or substitutes for the classicals.
So you bring up a very interesting thing. One of the things I also did was I tried to grow some of the American analog or similar plants at the garden I had in San Francisco at the college. Because I thought there was a potential there. And Stephen Foster, the gentleman I mentioned earlier, who is a Western herbal researcher, he actually wrote a paper on, what did he call it? The disjunction of medicinal plants or something between, or plants of Southeast Asia and southern United States. And when I went to Missouri, to that farm that I was telling you about, Elixir Farms, that was with Vinnie McKinney. When I went there, they had a number of plants that were what I would think might be analogs or very similar plants to some of the Chinese medicine plants. And I wanted to, I would love to have known a researcher who could test that out and see if there was any substitution. I know there are people like Michael Tierra, who's a Western herbalist, and what was his name? There's a gentleman too up north, wrote a book on medicinal mushrooms. I can't remember his name now. He also was looking at plants that might be, used from here that were substitutes. And there's a company, herb company, KW Botanicals. They make tinctures. Brian Weisbuck, he's up in Sebastopol, and he actually uses some Western herbs as substitutes for some of the Chinese ones. I think there's potential there. Again, this is the kind of thing that needs to be researched more, but I think there's possibilities, because obviously, these plants could have a great deal of efficacy if they work the similar ways, because they're from here, and the genetics, as you say, would be available to us. And, speaking of that, like echinacea, which, some of you may know of, they did a study of echinacea plants and their compounds from the northernmost part of their populations to the southernmost, and there was quite a distance that they covered, and they found some huge variances in the chemical makeup, the nature of the different populations. So.
Hi, I have a question on stinging nettle. Do you have any medicinal information on it?
So, it's interesting, the Chinese actually have a nettle, two or three different species of nettle that grow there. They're called scorpion grass, Schweizerzaun. And the nettles, the thorns on them are like our nettles on steroids. They're really nasty. Nettle is great for, like if you eat it, it's great for building blood. It's also a cooling herb. I think it does do some heat clearing. I'm not that familiar with some of its other possible uses, but like I said, it's great for building blood. It's used as a nutritional thing, and it's used frequently for that purpose. Now, you can use the nettles homeopathically. The idea of homeopathy is using like to treat like, and I'll give you an example here. When I was in that West China University of Medical Sciences that I mentioned about earlier, there was down this little path from where I was staying, my room, there was a showers that these students would take their showers in. There was a wall right there, and the water would leak underneath it, and they would pool in this area here on the dirt, and the mosquitoes, of course, loved that. And so they would get into my room at night, and I'd get, bitten to death. So I had a bunch of mosquito bites on my arms. And growing, the nettle likes this damp area, so growing right there in that corner, now there's an idea in herbal medicine that says, where you have a problem, the plant will be there to treat it. And this was a perfect example. So the nettle was right there growing, this Chinese nettle, really nasty thing. So what I did is I took out my scissors, and I cut off a piece of this, and I held it with the scissors, and right near the mosquito bites, around in a circle, I stung myself with the nettle. So I was, kind of getting myself, this inflammation, creating a little inflammatory response. And immediately the itching stopped. And within just a few hours, the whole mosquito bite just disappeared. So, you can use it that way if you want on some kind of, external itchy, burning, stinging inflammation. There's even bee sting therapy too that people use. Some of you may have heard of that. They use on arthritic conditions. You could probably, I bet, use nettle and stinging plants like that in a similar way.
One more question. How about moringa?
Which?
Moringa. It's a plant.
Moringa? Moringa?
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with the uses of that. I know I have heard of it, but I don't, unfortunately, I'm sorry, I don't know what the uses of that are. It's a bottle tree, I think they call it, or something like that? Yeah. In the garden? Yeah. You could probably find something online about that, but I'm not familiar with it. It's not a plant from China in Chinese medicine.
Hi, Hi, I was wondering if you have any sources for seeds so we could grow our own herbs, and also any reference books on how to germinate and what sort of specific conditions are needed.
So you're asking for sources for these plants?
Yeah.
And also books on how to grow them?
And then also if you do any local lectures or anything like that.
What was that last part?
Any lectures or teachings?
Oh, teachings?
Yeah.
You know, Jean Giblett at High Falls Gardens, sometimes they do go around and talk about that. They're in New York, but they do, you know, go around and do presentations with Peg. I don't know if Peg's still doing that, but Peggy Schaefer, but she was doing that, I know, years ago. And Jean may still be probably involved in that. Stephen Foster did write a book. Look it up. It's about Chinese medicinals. He talks about a number of important herbs and how to grow them. For sources for seeds, boy, it's been years since I've tried to do this. Now, probably strictly medicinals. They used to be called, what was it up north with Richard Czech, Horizon Herbs or something, I think they were. But now they're called strictly medicinals. And they probably do Richter's in Canada. I think they may still exist. Richter's is spelled R-I-C-H-T-E-R-S. And you can find stuff on Etsy or on eBay. Some Chinese suppliers are selling, you know, stuff like that now. You know, I'll say buyer beware from some of these because some of the stuff's not correctly identified or the seeds are old and they don't germinate. But what you do is maybe you buy a packet or two from some of these suppliers in China and you try them, and if they work and you can identify them later on, maybe when they get older, then you can go ahead and buy more. I wouldn't spend a lot of money on those. There's companies that I know sell in bulk, but you don't want to buy these. You have to buy like pounds or half pounds of them. So unless you're farming, it's not realistic. But there's other people, like I say, on Etsy and eBay that do sell small, you know, packets of those. And sometimes there's some people here in the, you know, that are located here in the West that do also do that because, you know, they've become more available. You just have to find the Latin name and then do a search for seeds, you know, do a Google search for seeds, and you'll see some things come up. Or even, like I say, on Etsy or eBay with the Latin name. There are some Western suppliers, but like I said, try Richter's, try strictly medicinals. Challenges to what? To growing them in this climate. Well, yeah, I mean, certain herbs are definitely going to be better here, and certain ones are not going to be. You know, we have a Mediterranean climate here, typically. You know, we don't get cold winters, and some stuff, especially things that are from temperate regions and more northernly areas, are going to a lot of times prefer those colder winters. But you can still grow some of those things. You may not be able to get the greatest medicine. You know, if you're not growing a farm anyways, you're not going to get, you know, most of those things you plant, you're not going to be able to get much out of them. You know, there's a few things like, especially the weedier type stuff like dandelions and stuff, you could probably pick leaves and stuff and occasionally use it, or something that produces seeds. But, you know, if you've got to pull the whole plant out, you better be growing quite a few plants in order to get enough to probably produce enough medicine, or the bark, you know, where you're going to, you know, be taking the bark off of a tree. So if you're growing them more for interest and, you know, just to connect with them, that's great. If you want to really grow them for usage, then like I say, some of the more weedy ones, grassy ones, what you're using the leaves for, you might be able to get away with, you know, getting enough for that. Yeah.
I just would add two things. So for our medicinal garden, we did source some of the seeds from strictly medicinals. But also the Huntington does a plant sale twice a year, and in November and March. And at least the goal of the medicinal garden team is that we will start selling like a starter pack of 5 or 6 medicinal plants that people can take home. I think they will be seedlings rather than just seeds. We're not exactly sure yet, but that is our goal. And then Peg Schaefer, whom we've mentioned several times, wrote a book called The Chinese Medicinal Herb Farm that's a guide to, I think, 78 or 79, the cultivation of 78 or 79 medicinal plants. And I mean, she was growing in Northern California, so the conditions are a little bit different, but basically everything that she mentions in that book does well down here too. And if you're really local and feel like volunteering in a medicinal garden, you can learn a lot from our team. We meet every Wednesday. Michelle, who's circulating the microphone and is wearing black in the back, is in charge of the medicinal garden and does a wonderful job with our group of volunteers.
And I'll mention too, there's a number of plants that are in cultivation as ornamentals that are used, as major herbs in Chinese medicine. Balloon flower, platycodon, Lonicera, honeysuckle, there's magnolia trees. There's a lot of things actually that you'd be surprised how many are used as major remedies that are available as ornamentals. Forsythia, and definitely you should go to the sale, then they start selling the plants. That's an easy, nice way to get them.
Yeah, we were talking earlier, almost every plant in a Chinese garden is used medicinally.
One is not medical. Several involve medicine. And you mentioned that you brought some plants in. Did you have any problem with the agriculture department bringing foreign plants back to the U.S.?
Could you repeat that?
You mentioned that you brought some plants, seeds. Did you have any problem bringing in foreign plants into the U.S.? Do you get quarantine of the plants or from Department of Agriculture before you can import it?
I'm going to take the fifth on that. Muggsy told me not to say anything about that.
USDA regulations were different though.
Questions are medical. Since the Chinese prescriptions are pre-written, and many of the plants they use belong to the same species, same genus, but different species, different potencies. How do you select the right prescription for it? That's one question, number one. And second question is that since you're a practical practitioner, and many of us here of the age may be taking Occidental and Oriental medication combined, as a practitioner, do you or do the doctors consult with each other, make sure the patients aren't overdose or underdose under certain conditions?
I'm sorry, with the echo, I'm having trouble hearing it. Can you hear?
The second question was about if a patient is taking both a Western medication and a Chinese or Eastern medication, like how do you deal with the potential
interactions? Yeah, so that's a good question about the interaction between Western and other substances, herbs, whatever. You have to be careful. Some interactions are already known, some contraindications are already known, like I was talking about ginseng and high blood pressure, and there's a bunch of ones that you can actually research on the internet. As a practitioner, you have to know these things. There's certain herbs I won't use if people are on certain medications for depression or sometimes insomnia. Sometimes I'll avoid certain herbs that I think might interact. And I'm always having patients take them at a very different time of the day than they take their Western meds, even if I'm giving them herbs at the same time as they're taking their Western meds. There's a practitioner, Dr. John Chen. He's written a book on basically these interactions between Western drugs and Chinese herbs. So practitioners should be learning about that and be aware of that before they prescribe anything. Some practitioners won't prescribe herbs when people are on Western medications. They want to be more careful about it and more conservative about it, and that's obviously a certain very responsible thing to do. But you can do that. You can give herbs with Western drugs, but you have to be very wise about it, very careful. And what was the first question?
The other question was about if there are multiple species within the same genus that can be used medicinally, like, how do you think about the dosages or efficacy of those, the relationships between, I guess, different species within the same gene?
So in that question, I need to ask you something. Are you talking about, let's say, different species that are used for the same herb, the same remedy? Yes. Okay. So, yeah, that's certainly a very difficult problem. I mean, I'll tell you this too. Practitioners often forget, these substances are from nature. They vary. You know, we're talking about populations, and somebody over there was, mentioning that gentleman there. The genetics from one population vary from, one to another. Weather conditions and environmental conditions change from one year to the next, which can affect, as I said already, chemical composition. There's all kinds of variations that can occur from different factors. So when we get a dried material in the pharmacy at one time, is it going to be the same as what we've gotten 6 months ago? Or is it going to be the same as what we got 6 months later? And if we get one of these secondary species or another species that's used as a primary species, but it's different, is it really going to have all of the exact same effects as the other one that we were using maybe, previously? There's really no way to be sure. This is why you used a formula also. When you put together a formula, you use multiple herbs sometimes for the same issue, and you're trying to address that from different approaches. And you may use 3 or 4 different herbs to do the same thing. Now, let's say one of those herbs isn't really very good quality material this season that was, used for that product. Okay, well, you've still got 2 or 3 other herbs that you've used for that same purpose. And there's a lot of good reasons to use formulas because you can, as I said, do multiple things at once. You can help balance out some part of the formula that might make somebody worse if you don't balance it out, because this part of the formula is very heating, as I said before. And if you balance it out with some cooling herbs, then you don't end up making somebody overheated more. Or you can be doing something like, for example, like I was talking about with the yin chow san and using that for, wind heat, infections. You can add a couple of herbs that'll help strengthen the immune system and also help prevent those bitter cold herbs from weakening the digestive system. So, that's a good reason for a formula. So, it doesn't keep me up at night, but it is something I was concerned about too, because, right away growing those things, I knew, okay, these things could vary. They could vary, and they must vary in China. And, also some of these herbs, one time they can come from the north and another time they can come from the south, the same herb. So is that going to be exactly the same in its properties? Probably not. Which functions are not going to be exactly the same, or is the temperature going to change? And you look at the books, like I brought a couple books that I was going to give, just show people the big books that are used now for the materia medica. There used to be the Zhongyao Dazi Dian, which was the big dictionary of Chinese herbs. Now it's the Zhonghua Bensao. And these are like, the Zhonghua Bensao has like 12 volumes. There's a lot of substances listed in there. And, you look at that and they talk about sometimes other books, in older books where these herbs were first mentioned, and some of the properties or the temperature or taste are different. What are you to make of that, And, things evolve, things change. And, I think understanding, starts to evolve and information, develops. And so, there's a lot more that needs to be done in this regard. I think it's a huge, vast opportunity for somebody, but I don't know if it's going to make them any money.
I'm going to pose one question from online. The ACTCM closed last year, is that right? Do you know what the fate of their plant material is? I
don't know what happened to it. I hope that they, put it in the hands of somebody else, that it didn't just, get, uncared for. But I don't know what happened to it. I really, wish I did.
Maybe we'll take one or two more questions.
Yeah, I was curious when you mentioned the very different properties and effects of Korean ginseng and American ginseng. And so I was wondering if the species, first of all, is there an American ginseng that is native to a part of the United States? And if not, was it imported and now it's evolved in a different way? So are there different species, or are they the same? And it actually kind of touches a little bit on the conversation we've been having about the variation of species, because these are both ginseng, right? But can you just
they are different.
Talk about the different qualities and whether it's native or not?
So American ginseng is Panax quinquefolius. It's a different species, actually, same genus. The Asian ginseng typically that comes from China that's used for ginseng, and the Korean ginseng is Panax ginseng. So they're different species. They are not the same. And the American ginseng is native to here. It's native to parts of the Midwest and southeastern United States. And so there are people that are still growing it there, trying to make a living at it and selling it for huge prices now. And then the Asian ginseng, typically the most famous place that the Panax ginseng grows in Asia is in Jilin province, and that's up in the northeastern part of China. So, and these are cultivated, although what people are getting smart about, because I was mentioning this actually earlier at our lunch that we were having, if it's cultivated, the ginseng likes to grow on the side of a mountain. I think it's the north-facing side of a mountain, and it has certain plants that it likes to be around. And this is probably true in China as it is in the United States for American ginseng. Once you try to take it out of that environment and grow it in some flat beds, in some other area, it tends to become very weak. And so you have to use fungicides on it to keep it from rotting. And I don't think the medicines is probably as good quality. So what they've started to do is they'll cultivate it in the wild. They may start seedlings in the beds where they, near where they want it to be, where they're located. And then they'll transplant the seedlings onto the side of the mountain and let them develop there. And they don't have to use chemicals. They just let the environment, the native environment, let the plant grow and develop. You want to avoid some parts of private property in some parts of the United States, because some people will shoot you if you go on their property thinking that you're going to steal their wild American ginseng that they may be cultivating there. Yeah, they're both different species. And that probably has something to do too, of course, with the genetics and what makes them different in their properties. Although the raw ginseng, Asian ginseng, is more similar to the American ginseng in its properties. When it's not processed and steamed, then it actually has properties that are closer to the American ginseng.
Maybe we can take one final question.
So earlier, I think you mentioned that example of the story where there was like the woman and she had like the nephritis and like the infection, she had the antibiotics as well as like the kinesiology. So I think to me that was kind of like evaluating Western medicine from an Eastern medicine lens. Have you had any experiencing with kind of doing the opposite, where like Western medicine has this very like experimental data, or like evaluating Eastern medicine or like more holistic treatments with that scientific lens to kind of be able to combine it and integrate it?
Did you get that? I didn't quite catch all of that.
Do you mind repeating the question?
Yeah, so like the example that there was kind of like almost like viewing antibiotics or Western medicine through more of a holistic medicine lens, like looking at the meridian points. Do you have any experience with the opposite? So kind of like examining Eastern medicine or holistic treatments through that very scientific or Western experimental lens.
Oh, okay. I don't personally have experience, but there are people, a lot of people doing research on acupuncture and on herbs. Europe's done a lot of research, especially, and of course in China and Japan, they've done a lot of research on herbs from Western scientific analytical standpoint, analyzing the compounds that are in them and testing them and seeing what their effects are. And they've done, on acupuncture points, they've done scans of the brain and nervous system to see what points might do to affect a certain part of the brain or affect a certain part of the body. So there are people that have been doing and are continuing to do research on this.
I'll just add one thing. There's a professor at Johns Hopkins University, Lan Li, who's a historian of Chinese medicine. And she's just about to publish a book that looks at the relationship between acupuncture and neurology. And really, at least for the past 100 years, neurologists have been obsessed with trying to figure out whether you can map, acupuncture points onto the nervous system. And there have been multiple different approaches to that question. Similarly with herbs, a number of different herbs, perhaps most famously Artemisia, have been examined to figure out the precise chemical compound that creates the effects that have been identified in Chinese medicine. At least, I'm not a historian of medicine, but to my knowledge, there's not been an attempt really to understand to offer a scientific analysis of the more holistic effects that you're alluding to. It's usually, as is generally true of modern science, the point usually is to identify very specific things that have very specific functions. And once you try to look at a larger picture, the frameworks just don't quite communicate, it seems like. But it could just be that I'm not aware of that sort of research.
There was a researcher at UC Irvine, I think he was doing some teaching at Emperor's College too, who's been studying acupuncture points and effects, and they've seen, looking at the brain and seeing what, it does. So, yeah, there are people out there doing it. It is hard to sometimes, like Dr. Bloom said, it's hard to sometimes, match the paradigm together because there is a difference. It's like, some of the studies they do on holistic approaches, treatments, they want, a very specific thing that they can do for everybody in the group. And the problem, like I said, is holistic approaches don't do that. They individualize the treatment. So the results sometimes come out good and sometimes not so good. And the problem may be in the way that they've structured the testing, because they're trying to use, the same treatment on everybody.
I guess I'd also say that just in China, the medical system today really is kind of structured around bringing these two systems together. Almost any hospital, of course they're public hospitals, any hospital you go to in China will have a department of Chinese medicine that complements the other departments of biomedicine. And they do, and really since 1949, there has been a major effort there to bring these two systems together, and at times to kind of explain the two systems in the other's terms. So in China, it's possible to get these kind of dual treatments for singular conditions in a way that's not as possible yet in the West.
Yeah. It'd be nice if we have that one day. I'd like to see that.
So please join me again in thanking Dr. Newman. This was... And I also would just like to say we'll have another lecture in this series on Chinese medicine on Thursday, November 21st at 2:30 p.m. On that day, Professor Michael Stanley Baker from Nanyang Technological University in Singapore will be joining us. He's a historian of Chinese medicine and will be talking about the ways actually that herbs have moved from different places both within China and from outside of China to China, and how the movement of pharmaceuticals can affect their efficacy, but also actually affected how Chinese medicine itself developed. So it should be a very interesting talk. So, and again, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Newman.